Hello and welcome to the local food co-op training program called Content in Hand, getting the best rich media from your mobile device. I'm your host, Wayne MacPhail, and we're in part 4 right now. We're going to be looking at lighting and exposure. This is a really important part of taking really good photographs and video with your smartphone, because if you don't understand how to control focus and exposure, particularly separately, and we'll be talking about that very soon, you can't take really good pictures or the optimal pictures with your smartphone. So let's dive right in. Light is the most important aspect of taking good photographs, and that seems self-evident, but when you actually dive into it, it's a little more complicated. Light can be your friend. Here's an example of shadows creating what could have been a really dull photograph by creating geometric patterns with the light. Here's another example where the light itself tells a story because the light is casting a shadow, and that shadow gives you the full image of the gentleman in front of me here. And it means that I can crop the head off deliberately because the entire body is captured by the shadow. Here's another example of a lot of different light play. Light directly, light bouncing off of buildings, light bouncing off of buildings where it's bouncing off of buildings. And it gives you a sense of how you can almost compose photograph just using light alone. Here's another example where the light from the clouds and the sunset create the photograph. It almost looks like the clouds are being supported by the overhead trolley wires there. Here's another example where you've got light really composing the image because you've got that line of track light against the black background of the subway, and then the black people in the background there, the black coats against the whiter background. Here's another example of how light can really tell a story and improve a picture. Here's a terrible picture I took deliberately in a coffee shop. You've got a busy background. You've got a gentleman reading a newspaper with a weird thing over his head. You've got a lot of junk in the foreground. So it's a terrible photograph. But if you just rethink the lighting and exposure and move a little closer, you can really change that photo dramatically and still tell the same story. The gentleman is reading a paper, he's eating lunch, but now that the exposure is focused on him and not the background, and the background is blown out and you're getting that wonderful side lighting on his face there, story is much clearer, richer, the image is much stronger. So let's take a look at how I took that picture from a light point of view, an exposure point of view. In terms of light, there's light coming from the street on the back of his face, which we can't see. There's some what's called ambient light coming from another window just in front of him and some behind. It's quite a well-lit coffee shop. And then there's ambient light from less strong ambient light coming from the coffee shop itself. And you'll see that red dot there. It means that I'm exposing for his arm. So, and we'll talk about how to do that in a very little while. Here's another example of ambient light filling the face here. There's some light coming from the side, but there's also ambient light bouncing off the sidewalk. In this case, it was quite a light sidewalk. And there's some coming from an awning overhead. Here's a young woman in a coffee shop with light coming from the side, coming from the window just off to what would be her left. And it's a nice shot, but if she just turns her head a little bit and faces the camera, the light catches her in an entirely different way. Here is the exposure for the light coming in through the window. Here's another photograph, the same woman, same place, but now the light is playing across her face in a very, very different way. And it's a matter of just turning her head. We still got that main light coming from the window outside, catching her face, and it's very dark inside. Here's another example of a young woman, again in a coffee shop, and this is an example of extremely flat, in this case very flattering lighting coming from a large window in front of her, and then more light coming in off to the side with some light in behind. And you can see that the background behind her is a fair bit darker because she's closer to the outside light. And we'll talk about why that matters in a little while. And you can see that I'm exposing for her forehead there and focusing on her. Here's another example, exposing this time for the background so that the foreground is in darkness or semi-darkness, and you can see that I was trying to mirror the statue and the pose of the woman inside. And there's the lighting for that. light coming from behind her, I'm shooting it from the dark into her, and I'm exposing for the external light, so you can see that red dot up there. Another shot where, again, coffee shop lighting coming in from outside, and the exposure is for outside, so the interior guy is in more semi-darkness. Again, I'm really happy with this portrait, partially because of the drawing behind her sort of mirrors her. But again, side lighting coming in from outside, and in this case, there's a light wall just off to her right that is filling ambient light in. So you might at this point be asking the question, well, how can I actually expose for different things with a smartphone? Aren't they just being exposed by what's in front of the camera, right in the center of the camera? Well, with the actual camera app that comes with the iPhone and with the Android phone, that's true. What you focus on is what you expose for, but it doesn't have to be the case. So let's just take a look at examples of where it's problematic and how you solve that problem. So here I'm using the standard camera app on the iPhone, and you'll see that the foreground, the microphone, is in focus and the background is out of focus. If I want to change that so I focus on the background, I simply tap on the background, and there I am. And I can expose on the background, and it's the natural state for this camera app. And you can see if I slide up and down, I'm just moving my finger up and down, I can change the exposure of the background there to get it the way I want. Or I can tap here on the microphone, and now I'm focused on the microphone, but I'm also exposing for the microphone. You can see the background's out of focus. So here's the problem. What if I want to focus on the microphone, but expose for the background? I can't really do that. The best I can do is I can tap on the background here, and if I click and press and hold here, you'll see that the square bounces, and now I'm locked on the exposure and the focus for the background. And you can see that at the top with the little yellow thing that says AEAF. That means auto exposure and auto focus lock. So I'm locked there. So if I come back to the microphone and put it in the center here, I'm still out of focus because I'm locked on the exposure and the focus on the background. So here I'm back on the microphone, I'm exposed for the microphone, and I'm focused on the microphone. But what if I wanted to expose for the microphone but focus on the background? There's actually no way to do that in the built-in camera app on the iPhone and on the Android platform. So that's a real problem because there's often situations where you do want to focus on one thing and expose on another, and that's especially true when you have a background that's brighter or darker than the foreground. So no way to do that. Not ideal for taking photographs, especially when you have a small sensor with a narrow dynamic range. So what can we do about that? Well, what I'm going to do is just pop over to the main screen here. Now I'm opening up an app called Pro Camera. And here's Pro Camera. And now I have an ability, because I've got two different exposure and focus points here, that I can actually focus on the microphone and expose for the background. So I'm changing the exposure as I move around the background. Or I can do the reverse. I can focus on the background and expose for the microphone. And this is very useful when you, again, when you have brighter backgrounds or darker foregrounds or whatever. And if you move the focus around here, you see I'm focusing on the microphone now, but now I can expose for the background, I can focus on the background and expose for the microphone. So a lot more flexibility. And really, if you want to take good pictures with your smartphone, you really need to separate that focus from the background so you have the greatest control over your camera. And if you don't do that, very often you're going to get suboptimal pictures because you don't have that kind of control. Now, I hope that was helpful, and I hope that you do go after some other kinds of apps on your phone that allow you to separate that focus from the exposure. It's really important. And now I want to talk a little bit about exposure, because understanding exposure for a smartphone is really the essence of exposing well and getting a good image, or getting the best image. You can see here, here's an example. The middle image is nicely exposed. The ones off to the one side or the other one is darker, the other side is overexposed. And we'll talk about how you do that and why that matters. So One thing to think about or understand about most smartphones, and I'm generalizing here, but most smartphones, when they see the world, they see it as if it's 18% gray. And here's an example of what 18% gray looks like. And that's really important. And here's what that means. It means if you point your camera and treat it like it's a light meter at something that's predominantly black, and in this case, completely black wall, say, it's going to say, oh, that's 18% gray. But if you point it at something that's predominantly white, in this case a white wall, it's going to say, oh, that's 18% gray. So that means that in the case of the black object, it's actually overexposing. And in the case of the white object, it's underexposing. And so here are some examples. So here is a very black oven in front of some straws, white straws. And the problem here in this image is that the oven, which is really black, is being exposed pretty close to 18% gray, which is exactly not what was in the real world. And as a result of that, the straws are overexposed and the highlights are completely blown out. There's no detail in them. This is what the scene actually looked like, and this is what the camera should have seen. And if you control exposure and focus separately with your app on your phone, you're going to get this kind of result as opposed to the previous result. Here's another example, and this is probably more something you see more often. You might be wondering why a lot of the snow pictures you take look so dull, as if there's ash on the surface of the snow. And the reality is it's because your camera is seeing white and trying to render 18% gray. And in fact, this is really what the snow should look like. It's as it appeared. And again, you can adjust the exposure and get it right by using exposure control on your phone as opposed to focus control. Why does that matter? Why does it matter that you get that exposure right? Well, the reason is because sensors on smartphones are really small and they don't have the capacity to capture the full dynamic range of the real world. So here is what I mean by dynamic range. It's the range of everything from the whitest white to the blackest black. So in this case, we have the whitest white in this photograph is the side of the building here, the white side in direct sunlight. The middle sort of 18% gray is that middle arrow pointing to the Tip Top Tailors sign there. And then the darkest dark is the shadow in shadow around that arc of that window. And that's a really extreme dynamic range. And here's what that means for smartphones. The dynamic range of the real world, as we saw, is really wide. DSLRs with bigger sensors, and that's in the middle there, can capture some of that dynamic range, although it tends to be compressed. And that means that a range of blacks that are very close together get compressed and become one color black. And even down in the smartphone area where we're talking about, the dynamic range is really compressed, and often in a wide dynamic range, the highlights are being blown out if you overexpose, and if you underexpose, the blacks are going to get all packed up and you're not getting any detail in the black. And so what you want to do is get your exposure exactly right. So the limited dynamic range of the smartphone is optimally capturing the real world. So there's the dynamic range for DSLRs, there's the dynamic range for smartphones, much narrower. So here's an example. If you just use the exposure on the young woman here on the left, you would get a good exposure for inside, but you would blow out the background. If you expose for the background, you're going to block up the blacks in the interior of the bedroom, and you're going to get very little detail except in sort of the edge of the young girl there. So you want to expose well, you want to expose carefully, and you want to use an app that gives you the capacity to expose and focus differently. That way you're going to optimize the camera's ability to shoot pictures that have a high dynamic range, but even better, get the exact focus for any scene. And one of the rules of thumb is that you want to get the best exposure you can natively. And sometimes, in terms of creating a good photograph, that might mean not putting your camera in a situation where it can't deal with the dynamic range. We'll talk about that in a little while. But that's, I hope, a good introduction to the idea of lighting and exposure. Very important to understand. So I hope that was helpful, and I hope you do check out some software that allows you to separate focus from exposure. And I hope that was a good introduction to what exposure actually is and how you can use lighting to your greatest advantage when you're taking photographs. Next up in part 5, we're going to be looking at post-production and editing tools, and they're going to be allowing you to do some extra stuff to your photographs, maybe increase some saturation, maybe increase contrast, just to make your photographs a little closer to what you saw in real life, or sometimes to make them completely different from real life for whatever purposes you need. We're going to be looking at a lot of software tools, particularly on your phone, because it's a remarkably powerful device, and that will give you the ability to not only take photographs, but do post-production work on those photographs right in your phone. So I'm looking forward to seeing you next time. I'm Wayne MacPhail. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.